Hi there, and welcome everybody to this next session of the Analytics Excellence Certification Series. If you recognize my voice, I'm Tom Marlowe again, currently president of Black Hills IP Renewals, previously of Fairchild Semiconductor and the Schwegman Lundberg firm. And as always, I'm joined by Mr. Stignani. Hi, Mark. Mark?
Sorry, I had myself on mute there.
That's what I thought.
Also here, formerly of in-house counsel for Thomson Reuters, and also I've spent a great deal of time over the last 16 years in and around IP analytics and IP analytic platforms, doing different jobs, sundry and many. So glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me in.
Well, thanks, Mark. Great. So today we're going to be talking about how to generate patent family file history, and we're going to get into claim amendment type of analytics. This is the fifth of our 8 categories of analytics that we're going over for this certification course. And it's a little bit different, a little bit more, I think, requires a little bit more detail than some of the past topics. Some of the past ones that we've talked about require building portfolios, whether it be around an owner or a technology space, and trying to drive data analysis out of these groups of patents. When we get into this patent family and file history and claim type analytics, we're using a little bit of a different approach. It's more of using the microscope than it is using the telescope, and we're kind of taking a small data approach to it, where we're going to look at a single patent and data around that patent, or a single patent's family and data around, maybe just a handful or so of patents. So what that brings up is, well, okay, we know what a patent is, but what exactly makes up a patent family? And Mark, I'm sure you've been exposed to a few different definitions of what a family is over the course of your work.
Yeah, much to my chagrin in some cases, a lot of commercial systems define patent family as different things. I mean, if you are working with certain tools that define short families or small families, that is probably a lot of your exposure to patent families. But there's about 6 actual different family definitions out there between INPADOC, which is International Patent Documentation Center, and the Derwent Patent Index. I mean, there's a global dossier. There's other types of tools out there which define patent families a little different. So for the purposes of most, if not all, of my analysis, I define it as an extended patent family, which is all patent documents related, are linked to a priority document belonging to at least one family member. That allows a lot of leeway, simply because you can really get burned badly by going to a lesser definition in my historical work.
Well, it's comprehensive, if nothing else, and that is we're on the same page, because that's the same method that I prefer to use when I'm doing any kind of analysis around families. You know that you've caught everything.
Yeah, and that way you also catch things that were either filed too late for priority, countries that aren't part of the Paris Convention, and some of the domestic application numbers that aren't generally caught in some of the more simple versions of patent family.
Sure. So that's kind of defines where we're going to be looking at patent families. From the other part of the analysis is with respect to the file history. And so the file history of a patent is the I guess, kind of the docket of transactions that have happened during and sometimes after the prosecution of a patent matter. So these could be, simply the application is filed, rejections, amendments, arguments, appeals, changes in inventorship, changes in ownership, anything that can pretty much happen to the patent along its life, so to speak.
And what's really important about this is that without reviewing the file history, simply reviewing the patent on its face as published or as granted does not give you the full story of what has been given up. There's a theory called estoppel that helps us understand what's limited in that patent prosecution by review of the file history. So for those experienced people on the call, you know how maddening it can be when you're reading the face of the patent and then you go check the file history and find that they've entirely limited themselves away from probably the most important set of claim subject matter in their arguments in the file history.
And so along those lines, then, we're also going to be delving into, within a patent family, you've got the idea of a continuation and a divisional application. Now, of course, these can mean different things in the United States, and you can even get into continuations in part. In a lot of foreign jurisdictions, the terminology is merely around divisional. When I'm doing this kind of analysis, for the most part, I just like to lump the two together and try to reduce the ambiguity there. So I might say continuation divisional type applications. And it'll mean pretty much the same thing as a matter that was filed from another matter in the same country, I guess, while that earlier matter is pending. So it takes advantage of the filing or priority date from that original matter. This analysis that we're going to be doing, this detail analysis, is important because it allows us to get an idea of what is actually protected. In previous discussions that we've had, we're talking about much higher level data that kind of starts the conversation, and now we're going to get into some of the detail where we actually get to the nuts and bolts of the protection. Because you can do your high level 30,000 foot analysis all day long, but all that's going to get you at the end of the day is inferences, which a lot of time are very useful in a business setting. But at the end of the day, when you need to know exactly what is covered one way or the other, or exactly what was in some cases given up one way or the other, you've got to get into the nuts and bolts, and you've got to look closely. You've got to take a look at where the claims started, where they ended up, why they ended up that way, and what are the differences in the scope between matters within a family in a country and matters within that family from an international perspective. And what we're going to look for here is that consistency. One of the biggest takeaways that we're going to talk about here is, if I've got a patent in the US and then I've got 3 international filings that go along with it, just assuming that those international filings are going to have the same claim coverage as the one in the US is very short-sighted, and it's going to wind you up in trouble if you end up relying on that type of analysis too much. Digging into that consistency and what the differences are and where the disparities lie between countries is a big part of what we're going to be talking about. And then why? Were there additional references that were brought in, say, by the EPO that weren't brought up by the USPTO? Were there limitations that were required in certain countries because of the laws that they have? Were there just prosecution mistakes, perhaps? So we'll be digging into this not only just purely by looking at the patents and their file histories. That type of analysis can get a little bit, how would you put it, Mark? Mind-numbing?
Yeah, this is, like for those who've been with us for the whole series, this is the second hardest thing I think we're teaching here. It's because it's so exacting, it's so intricate, and it requires so much effort in it. And because of that, we also are going to use other tools to tease some of this out to show you in the presentation here.
Sure. Yeah, and so it's about how you lay it out, and it's about how you organize the data. And with that data, it's going to be able to drive really good decisions when it comes to valuing a patent or its family, when it comes to making annuity decisions, when it comes to litigation type settings, or licensing in the same vein, and even tax planning. So let's jump into this. So from an international perspective, we start with, well, what does the family look like? So we've got a patent here. We've got a granted U.S. patent, granted in 2015, filed in 2013, priority back to a provisional in 2012. And then we can take a look at what that patent's family looks like. So we can see its international spread on the map here. Sometimes the lists are just as useful. And we can see we've got multiple U.S. matters, we've got a PCT application, and based on the filing date data here, I can probably guess that this PCT was filed, and then another U.S., a European, a Canadian, and an Australian application were filed national phase out of that PCT application. So high level, I can tell also from a status perspective, the U.S. was granted, and we have our 3 international applications still pending. So this gives me that high level. From here, I need to dig in. I'm going to need to dig into the claim language and the scope of each of these international applications. I want to know, are they tied to, do they have similar claim scope as this U.S. one that was filed national phase? Or does their claim scope go back to the granted U.S. matter from which the PCT was initially filed?
And also, if you, sorry to interrupt, but also if you want, as you're going through the analysis here of the family, if you can get in and see if there are references or search reports cited on these various international matters that were not cited in the original application or in subsequent continuations. I mean, those are rich areas for mining of interesting data if you're looking to attack an original filing.
Yeah, absolutely. And in cases where we see multiple, say, divisional practice in some of these international countries, then again, where is that claim coverage going, say, in Europe as opposed to in the US or as opposed to in Canada? And it can give you an idea of which ways the owner is viewing value for that invention and the different ways that they're going to protect it in the various jurisdictions.
Yep.
Okay, so then let's take a look at, just to fill out the picture here, we've got, in addition to the international filing practice, we've got the continuation and divisional practice. So the items highlighted here are the U.S. continuation/divisional matters that were filed off of the U.S. parent. And what we see here is 1, 2, 3, 4 granted U.S. matters, and then 1 pending application that was recently filed just this year to keep the family alive. So clearly, the U.S. is an important market for this particular technology, and they're keeping the family alive. An interesting thing to take a look at here is going to be, well, what is the differences in the claim coverage between these 5 continuation divisional matters and the original?
And this is where we start having to dig into both the claim sets as well as the file histories, which will help us, because you can't just file the same matter over and over, as everyone knows. So the continuations have to claim something that was disclosed if they're a continuation purely that was disclosed in the original matter, but a different set of claimed subject matter. So you just have to start, parsing this apart with the claims, and then picking the scope of the limitations in each of the file histories as you're going into these analytically.
Yeah, exactly right. So what that means is that what we want to do is start digging into the claim language that we have for each of these matters. Are there differences? And then, Mark, like you mentioned, the file histories. So in the file histories, we'll have, from a high level, kind of this transaction list of things that have happened to a given matter across its history. We're going to see amendments. We're going to see appeals. We're going to see the references that were brought up either by the applicant or by the examiner. If they were brought up by the examiner, were they used in a rejection? How did the applicant try or succeed in getting over the rejection with an argument or an amendment? And all of that information is going to be telling of where the claims came from, where they're going, and some of the applicant's strategy as well.
And also in this, you can also see a lot of quality indicators about prosecution as well. Were there multiple amendments filed? Were there issues of abandonment or temporary suspension of rights that you can go back into? So this is such a rich area for again, mining out data that will help you make some quality judgments about an application or a grant. That I really want to make sure that there's just a ton of statistical evidence that something is better or worse in this file history.
Yeah, exactly. And as you're going through this file history data, if I'm comparing multiple patents or applications, pulling all this data together can be tricky to see any of the trends or any of the, basically get any of the revelations that you're looking for. So it's important to figure out how to lay this data out so that it can be viewed in a useful manner. And from a high level, a layout from a table perspective can be really helpful. So what we have here across the top axis are the list of patents in the family. So we've got 2 US matters, a Canadian and an EP matter here. And then in the vertical axis to the left, we've got the references that may or may not have been cited. Now, tools that will help do some of this analysis may be available, say, in a docketing system that you're using in certain, I guess, levels of detail. Docketing systems that have, say, IDS management sometimes have this type of visualization available.
Yeah, but the one thing is that it is difficult to tease out if you're one individual doing kind of work, reading sequential file histories and trying to make sure you've got post-it notes and highlighters where all these arguments are stated and there. So this is complex.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly, and I'm definitely simplifying it a little bit here for this chart to give the idea of, all right, this first patent application, it was cited on the IDS of the 909 patent. It was not cited in this 8 million series 909 patent. It was not cited in Canada. It came up in Europe, and the applicant made an argument around it. And you can see how you can take a step back and see where the data fell, where these references were used, and which ones were more or less relevant in the various cases through prosecution. Clearly, the 2 US patents at the bottom were more uniformly cited and used by examiners through the prosecution of the family.
And one other thing that might be helpful here is also if there were rejections issued, to highlight, what their rejection status was, whether it was an anticipation rejection or lack of unity invention if you're in Europe, European metaphor as well.
102, 103.
Yeah.
Yep.
All the shortenings.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a fairly high-level example. Let's take a look at some of the details that you can get from an analysis perspective as we start looking at a patent and its file history. So here's an example, and apologies for the size of the text, although I promise you don't actually need to know what the text says in order to get the gist of what's going on here. I wanted to make sure there was enough data on the screen so we could see it from a high level. But what we have essentially here is one U.S. matter. And down the left column here, we have its claims. Claim 1, Claim 2, Claim 3, Claim 4, and Claim 5. And across the top, we have events, prosecution events, application filed, office action with restriction requirement, interview summary, responses, advisory action response, and so on. And if we zoom in along those lines, what we see happening is early on we had a very short, probably overbroad claim that was part of the claim set. After an interview and a talk with the examiner may have talked some sense into the applicant, saying you need a little bit more detail in there, and an amendment is added. And then some prosecution happens, and then a final office action is issued, and another amendment happens. And what we're able to see very quickly with the red and the blue, with the coloring and the underlining and the strikeout, is the difference between the claim at filing and the claim after the final office action response. And we can not only tell, obviously there's a difference in the length of the claim, but we can see exactly what language was removed and exactly what language was added.
Exactly, and in many ways we can see how the examiner has required a more precise definition or a more straightforward identification of where the novelty is in this particular claim. And this is extremely helpful when you're trying to discover what is novel in a particular claim or not, because a lot of times you'll see this leap out at you in these types of summaries where the final claim amendment took it over the top and made it allowable. So you can really put some extra effort into looking at those specific language that was added or subtracted to bring it forward into a higher level of analysis.
One of the things that I like about this particular example too is some of the really precise details that you might not have caught otherwise without using a tool like this. So if you look here at the final office action time, the wherein clause of this claim had the word dispensed. And then if you go to the final office action response, you can see that one got marked up a little bit. And they changed it from dispensed to dispersed. And not being practicing in this particular field, I don't know if that has a big impact, but that would have been a tough one to catch just by reading a claim side by side.
And so just a little bit about what you're looking at here. This is a file history summary that we use fairly uniformly across the firm. It allows us to see what's happened in a file history you can get up a full file history kind of under your belt in 8 to 10 minutes versus the hours it would take to read, annotate, bring this back to yourself, and to figure out all these various facets in reading the file history. So we use this a lot for practice advancement. We can pick up something like this and look at it and become very familiar with what's happened in the chronology of the prosecution, and also start to really look for things like this dispersed versus dispensed thing. That could simply have been a typo. But as you, and you can also see where in an interview with an examiner, which you would arguably have come away with something that was allowable, actually didn't pass muster that when it finally came down to an office action. So that's, there's a lot of kind of insight you can pick up just in this single line of amended text.
And from a litigation perspective, whether this is you're using this to assert or it's being asserted against you, knowing all of these little changes along the way is incredibly useful, because you know it's going to get picked apart one way or the other during litigation. Dispensed versus dispersed is something that'll probably be argued, whether or not that has an impact.
Most definitely.
All right, so let's take another look at a report that could provide some insight based on file history data. So again, same patent. We're going to take a look at the file history data from a little bit of a different perspective. So here we've got, instead of the claim language, what we're going to take a look at are the arguments that were made in response to actions that happened during prosecution along the way. And so we can see, with respect to, say, a reference, what kind of arguments the patent attorney, the applicant, made in response, and if any of these arguments are repeated. And then this type of a report is useful when you're in a family type of prosecution environment and a reference comes up in another matter, and you can go back and take a look at the argument that was made, ideally to get over that reference in a family member.
And especially in a competitive standpoint, when you're doing this, if you see that there was an omission, whether in fact or by accident, you can look at these things, very, very quickly and make some decisions about how you may or may not attack the family based upon the omissions of references or the arguments made in one that was not then continued and argued in the other. By the way, these are file history summaries put together by Black Hills. This is something that I believe only they put together in the marketplace. So this is a fairly unique proprietary thing that Black Hills does. So if you're wondering how to make these things, talk to Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, that's right. One of the services that we provide through our analytics department.
So in the grand scheme of things, though, the file history, teasing stuff out of file history is serious and hard work, and in many cases it kind of also requires you to harvest all the glossary of the words used in the patents themselves and the file histories themselves to make sure that you understood what was actually claimed and how they defined it in each of those organizations or each of those continuation visuals.
Yeah, and the biggest benefit that you're going to get out of it is in how it's visualized at the end. Because unlike some of the other analytics where pulling the data together provides you a nice, pretty graphic at the end, you've got a lot more detail that you've kind of got to wrap your mind around, and it gets trickier to make that visualization simple. And it's more about the layout of the words, and it's more about, I guess you might call it messier analytics, because there's just more data that's on the page. But that also makes it more of a challenge to figure out how to get that data and that information communicated across efficiently and effectively, so that you can answer some of the questions that you're looking to answer from a business perspective. So along those lines, kind of the next way that we're going to take a look at this family type analytics is we're going to look at claim scope. and the progression or differentiation in claims across a family. And again, from a high-level view, essentially what you have here is you can put your patents, your matters across the top axis. So I've got two U.S. matters, a Canadian, and an EP matter again. And then the vertical axis is going to carry my, what I'm calling claim scope elements. So these might be like key limitations, key pieces, or characteristics of the claims of each of these matters. So in this case, I've simplified this. We've got, what, six claim scope elements, and we can see how they are distributed across this family. So clearly I've got my 909 U.S. matter and my 907 U.S. matter are differing claim scopes. The first one is related to an inertial sensor, more specifically an accelerometer, and the second one, an optical sensor with back EMF reduction. And then we can see, okay, my Canadian case is probably most related to that 909 US case because it relates to the accelerometer inertial sensor, and it looks like I had to add it looks like the applicant had to add the limitation of the feedback system. So it's a little bit more limiting than the US case from which it's most related to. And we might have a similar circumstance with the EP matter. Instead of limiting to the feedback system, they limited to three-phase voltage. So from a high level, I can start gleaning some of that information, and then I might actually take a look at the claims.
Yeah, and also as you're harvesting these terms and kind of the overlapping broad and narrow scope of some of the actual words used, you can start to do kind of a sufficiency analysis as to whether or not there was support in the specification for these descriptors, especially if the words weren't used explicitly in there. I mean, an inertial sensor could be an accelerometer, but not reverse. And not all inertial sensors are accelerometers. So there's another just kind of a unique aspect of harvesting this glossary out of the claims for your analysis.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that one up because I've seen that numerous times, right, where you've got an amendment that's multiple years into prosecution, and it almost seems like the attorney didn't look to see if there was support for that amendment, for that particular language in the specification. And certainly some countries are more lenient on that type of amendment practice than are other countries. But like, let's take the inertial sensor, for example. The spec might disclose an accelerometer. Maybe it doesn't disclose inertial sensor specifically. Inertial sensor might have made it into the claims. Does that present a potential weakness in the claims? Maybe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've had litigations where it hung up on an earlier generation of markup languages where the invention claimed an early version of a HTML, and down the road they were litigating on something that was claiming XML, and the word XML did not occur in any component of their specification, and nor had it even been invented by the time they started making claims to it. So they had a long rollback to get to their argument on how that covered the later markup languages. So.
Yeah, how does XML even make it into the claim language if it technically didn't exist as of the priority date of the application? That's an interesting one.
Yes, it was.
All right, so let's take a look at how about some specific examples of that kind of broad level claim analysis. This is
for introduction purposes, this is a claim chart of broadband and other types of antennas, along the line of cell phones. The first vertical purple slot is a as filed application. The second white slot is the actual published or granted application in the U.S. The third and the second purple slot vertical is the patent application as filed in Europe, and then also a later application is the next one. So you're actually looking at a single family member and the actual precise claims and how they were claimed in each of those markets as of their filing priority date. The other ones are unique matters off to the right, but the first four that we're looking at here vertically are a single family membership with published applications, granted applications, and then two different publication levels at the EP level.
And then within each of these colored vertical columns, you've got, oops, sorry, I clicked. You've got the independent claims in more detailed columns. So we've got claims 1, 3, and 19 for that first matter, claims 1 and 13 or 12 for the second matter. And so you can see we're getting into the specifics of not just the patent, but the various independent claims within the patent. And go ahead, Mark.
And basically what you're seeing on the right-hand, the left-hand column there are the different categories. I mean, this is one of the ways we treat these patents. We will break them into fairly large buckets where, certain claims talk about matching antennas, whereas other claims talk about microstrip patch antennas. So we're able to help the client visualize which patents matter and why they matter. And also we can help keep track of apparatus systems and method claims as well as we're going through this. So this is just an organizational visualization of these matters and the types of claim concepts that they've got within them.
Yeah, so this, once you figure out how the data is laid out here, I can with a quick glance take a look and see, for example, this first patent, the first two independent claims are for a system or apparatus, and the third one is to a method of making. And I can see how that's spread out. I can see how, like you said, the technology category is spread out across these matters, and then their status in that publication category, kind of middle set of rows. So then if we take this a step further, we start digging into the actual claim limitations. And some of these boxes are in green because we want to talk about them a little bit more specifically. But what we're looking at here is what are called scope concepts. Essentially, these are claim elements or paraphrasings of claim elements, and then they're mapped across the various matters within the portfolio. So you can see what kind of coverage actually exists within and between the matters in this family.
Precisely, and also you're able to very quickly see what things they have in common with other matters, especially using this kind of pseudo head note style of claim concepting. So if you look along there, right below where it says scope concepts, it's providing a multiband antenna. Now that isn't claim language, but the claims require a multiband antenna in all of those matters. So if you are able to avoid using a multiband antenna, you can then knock out and not utilize those all through there. So the next one down is selectively operating a plurality of et cetera. That is actually a claim fragment. So we can see how that's a universally used language in all of the family members, both European and U.S. And
then if you direct your attention to the green boxes in the middle, those exist. They're mapped between a few elements and the EP matter as current. And if you compare that to the EP matter as filed, you can see, okay, clearly there was an amendment that was made and these limitations were added. So for claim 1, the providing a single continuous antenna and the tuning of that antenna was added. And for claim 12, providing the single contiguous antenna and then operating a plurality of wireless RF transceivers was added to get those into what I believe is an allowable form.
Exactly, and also it's incredibly more narrow than what was allowed in the U.S. If you can look at all those additional limitations that they were forced to put in, it's and this is where the gold and the magic starts occurring in claim amendment analysis. So there's a question that came by here. Is machine learning used to parse through the application and find key limitations? To a small degree, this is human-reviewed machine parsing. So, the meta concepts are not machine concepts. They are basically, once the reviewer has looked at all the types of keywords and made decisions about similarities and synonyms and concepts that are used. Patents have very large and different language. So this is a human, this is a machine-supported human analysis that you're seeing here in front of you.
That's a good way to put it.
But it's also very fast. So this takes 20 minutes of work versus hours and hours of reading individual patents. The efficiency is amazing.
Yeah, definitely. And then what it allows you to do is have this mapping for the family, and then this information can be used for a number of different purposes, whether it's analyzing, say, what claims you want to go after in a continuation within this family, or additional foreign filing if that's still on the table. Whether it's analyzing a portfolio that's being licensed to see what kind of coverage actually exists and what the differences between the patents are within that family. Is this really a group of, say, a dozen patents that you're licensing, or when it comes down to it, are there actually only 1 or 2 that apply to the products that you're using? That makes a big difference, especially if you're thinking about trying to make invalidity arguments and you only have to focus on 1 or 2 of them instead of the whole family.
It makes your analytics a lot cheaper to get through once you've done this mapping. Also, again, this is a metaphor for question answering. As we'll hit further on here, we'll start going to examples. We can talk about how these will apply to various and sundry methods of evaluation or assertion or that sort of stuff. So stay tuned for a few more slides down the road here.
Yeah, and one of the other things, before we get into a couple of the examples that I like about gathering your data in this way, is if you store it right, your analysis with respect to the scope concepts is reusable. Meaning you've done this analysis once. The claims are related to multiband. They have a requirement for having multiband antennas. Some of them require a patch antenna. If this is a competitor's patent family, and I'm using this, let's say, for freedom to operate analysis, I can use that on product A, and then 2 months down the line, I can come back to this same data and use it again for product B.
I regularly use these maps on a quarterly basis to help my clients understand what's changed, what's modified especially in their competitive maps of the marketplace. Because if you get something that occurs late in priority but seems to get extremely broad coverage, then you have your prior art list right there for some form of PGR, or and you can pretty much pull how your arguments are going to fall onto that later matter very, very quickly out of this map.
So how about we take a look at an example or two. Okay. So here's an example of a licensing scenario. So I'm a company and I make impact absorbing products. And I've got a competitor that does the same. And they come to me one day and say, we've got a patent portfolio, a family that is reading on the way that you're making your impact absorbing material. Let's say it's hockey pads. And it's got this honeycomb material and a shear thickening material. That's what we're looking at here. And they show me their US patent, and they show me we've got international coverage as well. So I take a look, read the US patent. All right, yep, I've got honeycomb material. I use a shear thickening layer, and the rest of it, more or less, looks like what I'm doing, we'll say. And then I take a look at the family. I see, okay, there's a PCT application, there's a European application, maybe a Canadian application, maybe an Australian and a Japanese, for example. All right, some of those are important markets for me, so I guess I ought to pay this competitor a royalty that includes my sales in the US and in various parts of Europe and Canada, Australia, and Japan. And that might be the end of the discussion unless I start to look at, well, how does that claim coverage actually look when I'm comparing the US one that I've analyzed and the foreign ones that I haven't gotten into. And if I take, for example, the EP patent, the granted EP patent, it looks really similar. It's got the shear thickening material. It's got the honeycomb material. It's written in a little bit of a different way because it's more of a European claim style. But it's got all of the key elements that I looked at and realized probably apply to what I'm doing on the US side, except for one word. And that's the one highlighted in blue, that the honeycomb material is thermoplastic. And then a light bulb goes off in my head, and I say, well, wait a minute, I use thermosets, not thermoplastics, in my hockey pads. So now, when I go back to the negotiating table with this competitor, I'm talking only about the US market, because it turns out that the foreign patents all had this thermoplastic limitation to them. They aren't going to apply to me. And it raises another question in my mind. The reference that was brought up during prosecution in Europe mentioned it, or was part of the reason there was a reference brought up and thermoplastic was added as an amendment. So now I'm saying, well, why did they have to do that? And more importantly, why didn't they do that in the US? So now not only am I negotiating strictly with respect to the US market, but I might actually have an argument for an invalidity position on the US matter based on that reference that was brought up in the EP matter.
And that will change in negotiation 150% when you come back. A lot of times when people show up in your door with a large set of claim maps, they're trying to kind of bury you with paper or magnetic media. And so to be able to get something as crystal as this and put it back on the table when you're countering their negotiation tactic, it's life-altering.
Yeah, because it's, even if you show the analysis like this, it's very clear and it's hard to argue with.
Yeah, and also, especially if they show up with 40 patents to look at, and you put a chart like this up there with all 40 patents reviewed and asserted, they do take a much gentler tone with you at that point.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's take a look at this a little bit further from the softer side of licensing to the more pointed side of assertion.
Mm-hmm.
How, Mark, in your experience, how have you used this type of data from an assertion perspective?
Well, in many cases, what I'm looking at, in an assertion analysis, I'm looking for holes. So I'm looking at, country by country. I'm looking for those things we've talked about earlier. As, did you do something in litigation or in prosecution that would give a litigator an opening or an attack point? If you do have those things, you have to go back and fill the gaps. Use a continuation practice or do things that make your assertion much more straightforward. Also, I like to take the pivots in the claim analysis. Do the claims have decent scope, or do they have too much scope? Are they too broad and subject to fighting over? Are they actually a valid claim? I like to look at pivots on detectability because a lot of times it's much easier to put an assertion forward when it's easily detectable and it's right there in front of you. Like to work at them through a design around. So can somebody make a simple alteration of their process and not then be in trouble with the patents that we're looking to assert? And also, how well do they match? One of the things about patent valuation that nobody gets right is that patents are personal to whoever you're trying to assert against. What works for target company A is probably not nearly as compelling for target company B. So as you're putting these analyses together, you have to be precise with your claim scope. Otherwise, people laugh at you. I don't like that. So,
well, that's true, and it's never great to be in that position. It's those first three pivots: scope, detectability, and design around. And I think detectability is all too often sometimes overlooked, but it's incredibly important, especially as you're analyzing part of a family or part of a portfolio for assertion purposes. But those are all claim-specific characteristics. And then, like you mentioned, the target match is not just claim-specific, but claim and competitor or target-specific. And it really takes a combination of all four of those things to get an idea of, like you said, how valuable or how useful from an assertion perspective a patent or a single claim within that patent might be.
Absolutely. And a lot of times you're presented with a package of patents saying that they're all useful, but in truth, most of the time there's about 3 or 4 claims that are really kind of pointed at you. And this type of analysis quickly tells you which things you don't have to pay for. And so I tend to discourage that in clients who are wanting to assert a larger package that has minimal value beyond the 3 or 4 matters that are of real value. It dilutes your presentation.
Yeah, a lot of times in assertion or in a licensing situation, there's only a couple of patents or there's only a few claims that actually are really applicable. But nobody wants to come to the table with just 1 or 2 patents or just 2 or 3 claims. There's always additional patents that are in there and along for the ride to make it look like a stronger position. You want to be able to do that, but from the other perspective, you've got to be able to kind of call the wheat from the chaff in order to figure out exactly what you're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. So if they can't call shenanigans on you, you're in a much stronger negotiation position.
Okay, so another example of how to use this data, one that's near and dear to my heart, and pardon the spelling on this slide. We'll talk about this ex-Malpe, annuity decisions. So this is, you've got a patent that's coming up for an annuity. You have to decide whether or not it makes sense to pay the annuity and keep it around, or to save the money, cut and run, and let it go. And some of the factors that come into this are very family and file history specific. So I'm going to look at what's the family size. This is going to be a very simple starting point. Is it a big family? I've spent a lot of money building up this family. If it's large, I don't want to get stuck in sunk cost bias. But if I do see that it's a big family, especially one that's being actively prosecuted, I know that at some other point I've made the decision that there's value in this family, and it can help me bring that to mind more quickly. And I'm going to take a look at the status of the members of that family. Do we have other members that have been abandoned? Do we have members, is this mostly a issued family? Is this a pending family? And Mark, like you mentioned earlier, status doesn't tell it all. Because something that's pending or something that's granted doesn't necessarily give you all the information that you need at the end of the day. A granted patent with really narrow claims is nothing more than a granted patent with really narrow claims. It's just a set of really narrow claims which might not actually have a lot of value. So it comes down to those comparisons of claim scope. What does the patent that I'm looking at, how does that compare to the other ones in the family? And when I can see the difference, okay, this one has a limitation of, let's just go back to one of the earlier examples, it's got an accelerometer in it. Oh, I just heard back from the R&D group that the accelerometer version of this device isn't working. Well, it's not feasible. What we're trying to do defied the laws of physics. Well, maybe this is one where I'm going to save my money. Doesn't mean that the rest of the family is not valuable, but it means that that one is less valuable or not valuable because of the specific claim language that it has.
So time check here, we're about 2 minutes from finishing here, so we'll run through the rest of the slides here as fast as we can, but please stay if you can, stay on if you can. M&A,
let's go to the next example. In an M&A setting, Mark, I know you've been involved in a number of these over your time. You want to talk about how you've used some of this analysis for valuation with respect to an acquisition target?
Absolutely. When I start evaluating a company, I look at the family scope, the family size. They've spent a lot of money on family in different countries, and I want to overlay that against their R&D charges or their product sales in that marketplace. So I will look with a fairly strong depth as to the family size. I'll do claim scope comparison, see do they have the same coverage abroad. I also look at for cost savings, because if there's patent filings in marketplaces that I don't think my client will ever be in, I'll make recommendations that you can save money immediately by not pursuing patent work in those marketplaces. I also kind of look at where they're stuck or stale in their prosecution. So I look at RCEs, I look at how many amendments they're getting through, how efficient their counsel was in getting something through the patent office. This is largely U.S. analysis. But I also looked at, did they miss references as they're going through this? Did they miss? Did they open themselves to and made their portfolio vulnerable by this type of analysis or limitation through the file history? So always crucial to look at the family as well as the file histories along the family when they're running through that.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to see whether or not this is say a bloated portfolio where with a lot of narrow patent claims and continuation practice that were filed just to get larger patent count, for example, in which case I'm not going to put a lot of value in that. But also, a lot of times when a portfolio transfers hands, the seller has put off a number of, say, annuity or maintenance decisions, or even prosecution decisions. And knowing what the claim coverage is going into that will help make those decisions more quickly after the acquisition. And depending on what kind of benefits or gains or synergies you're looking for out of that M&A activity, you might not actually have a lot of value in the entire portfolio. And so there might be some cutting that can happen within the portfolio immediately as it's brought on to align it with your business strategy. And the last topic, before we end here is tax planning, and this is a pretty quick one, but it's kind of interesting to see if there's any interesting tax strategies either that you can use or that are being used by third parties by the owner of the patent to gain some tax advantages. And generally, it comes down to taking a look at the family and comparing the assignees on the matters within the family. A lot of times what you're looking for here are international patent applications that have a different assignee than the U.S. patent application.
And also you're looking for whether or not the assignee has a home base in a known tax jurisdiction, the Irish Republic or Ireland, Switzerland, Singapore, the various Bermuda and Caribbean islands.
Yeah.
So you're simply looking at it. It's a first indicator of advanced tax planning in an organization.
So a few of the quick takeaways that we want everyone to walk away with is that this is very much a small data, getting your hands dirty in the details type of analysis. Looking specifically at claims. Looking at some of the history within the patents, finding the weaknesses, finding the strengths, finding the differences between matters. And then, even though it's small data, there's a lot of detail. So dealing with that detail comes down to the way you lay out and visualize that data. The organization is incredibly important.
And also, as you're bringing these small data together, you can actually aggregate these as you're going through and start to establish a kind of aggregated value for your portfolio as you're getting these types of things done. So it's not just a small thing; it's a big thing when you add it all up.
And if you take away nothing else from this particular session, it should be not to assume that your international coverage for family members associated with a U.S. matter are matching. Because so often there's a different claim scope between your U.S. and your international matters.
So we're past the hour here, so if you have questions, go ahead and type them in. We'll hang on and answer your questions. If you don't, or you want to ask a question there, both Tom and I are readily available via LinkedIn or our various firm or business homepages. So I appreciate your time, and we'll take your questions. I'll give a couple more minutes for questions, but otherwise we'll sign off here.
Mark, here's a question. How can you use some of this claims analysis for matters that are pending in prosecution?
Well, especially if you're doing a continuation practice where you're targeting a particular competitor product, it is horrendously useful to put all your claims in one long map and to see, start teasing that out. Does it actually do a claim on claim comparison, and also is there sufficiency in your continuation? Otherwise, go back and try again. So this type of mapping is incredibly useful when you're thinking about, do I mine this continuation one more time, or have I covered the bases and with respect to that?
Yeah, actually I like that, especially when you've got a family that's got a long history of continuation practice. So you've got a fairly old priority date, and it's a family that's been kept alive, so there's probably competitor activity in the market. Being able to take a look at where the market has gone and going back to that initial application that you had, and we talked a lot about claim language, and we didn't really get a lot into the language of the specification. Maybe we touched on it briefly, but going into the specification as well to see if there's support to continue to protect over areas where the market has progressed.
And that's also, we're covering that in white space analytics for those who are left on the call here. We will, do that unfortunately in as hurried detail as we're doing this one, because it's also a very complex, that is the most complex of our analytics out there. So it looks like we're losing, people here, so I don't see any other questions coming in unless you see any.
Nope.
But we'll take a break here, and thank you for joining us, and please come see us again.
Yep. Well, hopefully we'll see everybody in a few weeks for our next topic. Thanks, everyone.